Somewhere along the Normandy hedgerows in the summer of 1944, a German machine gun crew sat waiting in their fortified position. They had spent the morning reinforcing their emplacement with logs and packed earth. Their fields of fire covered every approach through the dense bocage. Ammunition belts lay coiled and ready. A spotter watched the lane ahead through binoculars, while the rest of the crew ate cold rations and waited for the attack they knew was coming. They had not seen a single American soldier all morning, not a helmet, not a rifle barrel poking above a hedgerow, nothing. Then, without warning, the sky split open. Not one shell, not two, but dozens arrived at the same instant, erupting across their position in a single unified thunderclap of steel and fire. There were no ranging shots, no preliminary impacts to warn them, no whistling descent that might have given them a second or two to press their faces into the dirt. The earth heaved beneath them. The air turned black with smoke and pulverized soil. Hot metal fragments screamed through the space where men had been sitting moments before. Soldiers who had survived 3 years of combat on the Eastern Front, men who thought they knew everything there was to know about artillery, screamed in terror at something they had never experienced before. When the dust began to settle, the survivors looked out across the shattered hedgerow and still saw no Americans anywhere, no tanks, no infantry advancing through the gaps. Just silence and the smell of cordite and freshly torn earth. But the guns had found them. The guns always found them first. This was not an isolated incident. This was the defining experience of German soldiers across the entire Western Front. From June of 1944 to May of 1945, American firepower arrived before American soldiers did. It arrived without warning, from distances the Germans could not see, directed by observers they could not find, coordinated by a system they could not match. And on certain stretches of the front, the sounds of an entire phantom army drifted across the darkness, tank engines rumbling, bridge timbers being hammered into place, sergeants shouting orders, convincing German intelligence officers that tens of thousands of troops were assembling in places where no real soldiers existed at all. The answer to why German troops kept hearing American guns before they saw Americans lies in two extraordinary and largely untold stories. The first is the story of the most devastating artillery system of the Second World War. The second is the story of 1,100 men who fought an entire war with inflatable rubber tanks, giant speakers, and the terrifying power of sound itself. To understand the fear that American artillery inspired in German soldiers, you have to understand what made the American system fundamentally different from every other artillery force in the war. The guns themselves were not dramatically larger or more powerful than what the Germans, British, or Soviets fielded. Both sides had excellent weapons. What separated the American artillery from all others was not the quality of individual guns, but the invisible architecture that connected every observer, every gun crew, and every headquarters into a single responsive network. The revolution that produced this system did not begin on a battlefield. It began at a chalkboard, in the quiet years between the wars, at a dusty army post in Oklahoma. During the 1920s and 1930s, the United States Army was small, underfunded, and largely forgotten by the American public. Military budgets were slashed. Training exercises were conducted with broomsticks standing in for machine guns and trucks labeled tank. But at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a small group of officers used those lean years to rethink everything about how artillery should work. A young officer named Major Carlos Brewer, who served as director of the Department of Gunnery, threw out the old method of directing fire by named terrain features and visual landmarks. In its place, he introduced a new approach built around precise firing charts, battery positions located by careful survey, and targets plotted mathematically relative to a fixed base point. In the spring of 1931, Brewer and his team successfully demonstrated massed battalion fire under this new system for the first time. It worked. Multiple batteries, spread across miles of terrain, dropped their shells on the same target at the same time, directed by calculations from a single command post. Brewer's successor, Major Orlando Ward, took the concept further and formalized it into something that would change the nature of modern warfare. He called it the Fire Direction Center. The FDC was a command post, typically located at the battalion level, that centralized all the mathematics and communication required to coordinate artillery fire. Here is how the system worked in practice. A forward observer, hidden in a foxhole or a church steeple or a ditch, somewhere ahead of the front lines, spotted a target through his binoculars. He picked up his radio and transmitted a standardized call for fire, giving the target's grid location, a brief description of what he saw, the type of fire he wanted, and any special instructions. That message traveled to the FDC, where trained staff officers worked with maps, plotting boards, and pre-calculated firing tables to convert the observer's call into precise technical firing instructions for every battery within range. Those instructions went out simultaneously over radio and telephone wire. Within minutes, guns spread across miles of countryside could converge their fire on a single target. A higher-level FDC existed at division and corps level, allowing fire to be massed across multiple battalions and even across corps boundaries when the situation demanded it. This was the critical difference between American and German artillery, and it cannot be overstated. In the German system, coordinating fire from multiple batteries required careful pre-plotting by surveyors to establish exactly where every gun and every target sat on the map. This process took hours. Spontaneous massed fire by widely separated batteries in response to a sudden opportunity was, in practical terms, beyond what the Wehrmacht could reliably achieve in the field. In the American system, any battery within range could be brought to bear on any target in the entire corps area within minutes. If one battalion was already firing a mission, idle batteries nearby could automatically thicken the barrage without being asked. In an emergency, every gun within reach could join the fight almost immediately. The call for fire procedure had been deliberately simplified so that any junior officer and even many enlisted men could request artillery support. This democratization of fire support was unique among the major combatant armies of the war. A German officer, assuming he would have 15 or 20 minutes before American defensive fire arrived, and expecting to be warned by initial spotting rounds, instead found himself under immediate, accurate bombardment while many of his troops were still crossing the start line. The standard American divisional howitzer was the 105mm M2A1. It was a reliable, versatile weapon that could hurl a 33-pound high-explosive shell, approximately 11,200 meters, roughly 7 miles. The gun could fire up to 10 rounds per minute in short bursts and sustain 3 rounds per minute over longer periods. Every American infantry division fielded 36 of them, organized into 3 battalions of 12 guns each. Production totaled over 8,500 howitzers by the end of the war. By 1945, 1 out of every 5 shells fired by all American forces worldwide was a 105mm round from one of these guns. For heavier work, American Corps and Army-level artillery included the 155mm gun M1, known universally as the Long Tom. This was the only American towed artillery piece that earned a widespread nickname during the war. The Long Tom fired a 95-pound high-explosive shell to a maximum range of approximately 23 kilometers, roughly 14 miles. It could reach targets that the standard German divisional howitzer simply could not touch. Nearly 1,900 Long Toms were built between 1940 and 1945. By the end of the war, 40 American field artillery battalions in Europe were equipped with Long Toms, with 7 more serving in the Pacific, 47 in total. And then there was the monster. The 240mm howitzer M1, known by its crews as the Black Dragon, was the heaviest American towed field piece of the entire war. Its shell weighed 360 pounds. Its maximum range exceeded 23,000 meters. The weapon was so enormous that it had to be transported in 2 separate loads on wheeled wagons and required a 20-ton crane and up to 8 hours to fully assemble and emplace. A crew of 14 men served each gun. 20 battalions of Black Dragons were raised during the war, 15 of which served in Europe and 5 in the Pacific. Their first operational use came in Italy in late January of 1944, with the 697th and 698th Field Artillery Battalions of the Fifth Army. In March of 1944, 2 of these massive guns were redeployed from Cassino to the Anzio beachhead, where on their first mission they destroyed the Littoria Observation Tower, a major German strongpoint, and helped silence a feared German railway gun the Allies had nicknamed Anzio Annie. The sheer destructive power of the 360-pound shell was unlike anything most soldiers on either side had ever witnessed. What made the American advantage so frustrating for German artillerymen was that their own equipment was, gun for gun, broadly comparable. The standard German divisional howitzer, the 10.5 centimeter light field howitzer 1840, had a maximum range of roughly 13,400 yards. The heavier 15 centimeter heavy field howitzer 18 could reach about 14,600 yards. The legendary 88mm flak gun, adapted brilliantly for anti-tank and ground support roles, could reach a peak rate of 15 to 20 rounds per minute and was feared by every Allied tank crew in the theatre. German guns were well engineered, often lighter than their American counterparts, and served by experienced crews who understood their weapons intimately. The problem was never the guns. The problem was the system behind them. German artillery doctrine, rooted in the traditions laid down in the Truppenführung manual, required careful pre-survey work before batteries could coordinate their fire. Each battery commander typically controlled his own fire. Corps-level concentrations demanded hours of planning and preparation. The kind of spontaneous, multi-battalion massed fire that American FDCs could generate in 5 to 10 minutes was simply not possible under the German system. And from mid-1944 onward, German artillery on the Western Front fought under nearly total Allied air superiority. American and British fighter bombers hunted German gun positions relentlessly. Horse-drawn batteries, still common in German infantry divisions throughout the war, were catastrophically vulnerable to strafing attacks on open roads. American counter-battery fire, directed by L-birds and sound-ranging units, punished any German gun that fired more than a few rounds from a fixed position. The result was that German artillerymen found themselves outshot not because their weapons were inferior, but because the entire American system, from the spotter in the sky to the computer at the plotting board to the gunner pulling the lanyard, operated as a single integrated machine that the German command structure could not replicate. The human element that connected these weapons to their targets from the front lines was the forward observer. American forward observers operated far ahead of their own troops, often within direct sight of German positions, carrying a map, a compass, binoculars, and a radio that weighed over 60 pounds with its batteries. They crawled into foxholes, climbed into ruined buildings, and crouched behind hedgerows, watching and waiting and calling in fire with calm precision while bullets cracked over their heads. But the reach of American observation extended even further thanks to a small and unassuming airplane that became one of the most influential weapons of the war. The impact of the American artillery system was felt from the first hours of the Normandy invasion. On June 6, 1944, L-bird pilots were already airborne over Utah and Omaha beaches, correcting naval gunfire onto German strongpoints. In the weeks that followed, as American forces pushed inland through the dense hedgerow country of the Bocage, forward observers and their radios became the single most important tactical asset available to infantry commanders. The Bocage was a nightmare of narrow lanes, thick earthen embankments, and interlocking fields of fire that gave every German position natural fortification. American infantry could not see more than a few dozen yards ahead, but the L-birds could see everything from above, and the forward observers who crawled forward through the Bocage could call in devastating fire on positions that the infantry would have paid dearly to take by direct assault. By the time Major General J. Lawton Collins launched Operation Cobra in late July of 1944, the breakout from Normandy, his 7th Corps had perfected corps-level massed fires, using over 1,000 artillery pieces across the corps front, supported by approximately 140,000 rounds allocated for the offensive. The hedgerow stalemate was broken not only by air power and infantry courage, but by the systematic application of an artillery system that could reach any point on the battlefield within minutes of a single radio call. The Piper L4 Grasshopper was a militarized version of the civilian J3 Cub, a tiny fabric-covered aircraft with a 65-horsepower Continental engine, a wingspan of 35 feet, and a loaded weight of about 1,160 pounds. It looked like something a farmer might use to dust crops. It flew low and slow, typically at around 1,500 feet, and it carried no armament of any kind. More than 5,400 were built for military use during the war. Alongside it served the slightly larger Stinson L5 Sentinel, known to its crews as the Flying Jeep, with over 3,500 built. These little airplanes, collectively called L-birds, were assigned directly to field artillery battalions. 2 pilots and 1 mechanic operated 1 aircraft per battalion, with additional pilots at headquarters level. Their mission was to fly over the battlefield at treetop height, spot targets and enemy movements, and radio-precise corrections back to the fire direction center. The effect on German troops was immediate and devastating. When a Grasshopper appeared overhead, its small engine buzzing against the sky, German gun crews and infantry positions went silent. The calculus facing every German soldier was brutal. Firing on the tiny airplane gave away your position instantly, but failing to fire meant accepting the absolute certainty that artillery shells were already on their way. Most units chose to endure the shelling rather than reveal themselves, but even that silence was a form of suppression. The L-birds effectively paralyzed German batteries for as long as they circled overhead. The little grasshoppers were so effective and so hated that in the first 2 months after D-Day alone, General Bradley's First Army lost 49 artillery, spotting aircraft and 33 pilots to desperate ground fire. The Germans shot at them with everything they had, because they knew exactly what followed when a grasshopper found you. What made these tiny airplanes even more remarkable was the courage of the men who flew them. An L-bird had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and no defensive armament. Its fabric skin could be punctured by a single rifle bullet. Yet these men flew mission after mission, day after day, often making 3 or 4 sorties before noon, through rain and fog and anti-aircraft fire that would have given a fighter pilot pause. By the end of the war, high-ranking officers, including Generals Bradley, Clark, Eisenhower, Patton, and Stilwell, had all used L-5 Sentinels for personal transport over the front lines, a testament to the little aircraft's versatility and the skill of its pilots. The most famous L-bird pilot was Major Charles Carpenter of the 4th Armored Division, who earned the nickname Bazooka Charlie by bolting 6 M1A1 bazookas onto the wing struts of his Grasshopper and personally attacking German armor from the air. And in one of the war's most remarkable aerial footnotes, on April 11, 1945, First Lieutenant Merritt Duane Francis and his observer Lieutenant William Martin of the 71st Armored Field Artillery Battalion dove their unarmed Grasshopper on a German Fiesler-Storch observation plane near Dannenberg in northern Germany. They opened fire with their service pistols and forced the German aircraft to the ground. It was the last recorded aerial engagement in the European theatre. It was France's 142nd combat mission. But the single most terrifying innovation in the American artillery arsenal was a firing technique called time on target. In a conventional artillery barrage, shells arrived in sequence. The first few impacts gave defending soldiers a few precious seconds of warning to throw themselves into foxholes or press against the walls of their trenches before the full weight of fire came crashing down. Time on target eliminated that warning entirely. Here is how it worked. The Fire Direction Center broadcast a synchronized countdown to every participating battery across the sector. Each battery individually calculated the flight time of its shells to the designated target and fired at a precisely offset moment so that the first rounds from every gun involved, whether those guns were positioned 2 miles away or 14 miles away, arrived at the target simultaneously within seconds of each other. There were no ranging shots, no preliminary impacts. No whistling approach from a single direction, just a sudden, catastrophic wall of explosions erupting across the target area without any warning whatsoever. A time-on-target barrage from a full-core artillery could put hundreds of shells onto a single grid square in the same instant. The technique built on lessons from the First World War and was refined through interwar work at Fort Sill and during the North African and Italian campaigns. Its first large-scale application came during the assault on Cherbourg in June of 1944, where corps-level artillery was coordinated in a devastating time-on-target bombardment that stunned the German garrison. The psychological effect on German troops caught in the open was devastating beyond anything conventional sequential shelling could achieve. Making all of this even more lethal was a secret weapon that the Allies kept hidden until the darkest days of the Battle of the Bulge. The proximity fuze, codenamed Posit, was a miniature radar transmitter built into the nose of an artillery shell. Conventional shells exploded on contact with the ground, where much of the blast energy was absorbed by Earth, and a properly dug foxhole could provide real protection. The proximity fuse changed that equation entirely. As the shell descended toward its target, the tiny radar detected the ground and triggered detonation approximately 30 feet above the surface. The resulting airburst showered lethal shrapnel downward across a wide area, reaching into foxholes, trenches, and fighting positions that would have offered safety against a conventional ground burst. The proximity fuse was first used against German ground troops on December 16, 1944, the opening day of the Ardennes offensive, when Colonel Oscar Axelson of the 406th Field Artillery Group authorized its use on his own initiative before formal clearance had been given. Eisenhower requested and received authorization to use the fuse across all field artillery within days. Approximately 200,000 proximity-fused shells were fired during the Battle of the Bulge alone. General Patton later declared that the fuse had been instrumental in the American defensive victory. German commanders were so alarmed by the new shells that they offered rewards to any soldier who could recover an intact dud for technical analysis. German prisoners of war repeatedly described the demoralizing effect of airbursts, particularly during nighttime attacks, when there was no muzzle flash visible and no warning sound before the explosions seemed to come from the empty sky itself. The combined effect of all these innovations, the Fire Direction Center, the forward observers, the L-birds, time on target, and the proximity fuse, created a level of artillery dominance that no German unit on the Western Front could answer. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself acknowledged it, writing that the enemy possessed tremendous superiority in artillery and an outstandingly large supply of ammunition. A major serving in the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, describing the American counter-bombardment at Elsenborn Ridge during the Battle of the Bulge, said that he and his fellow veterans had experienced many heavy barrages in the war, but never before anything like what the Americans delivered. General Eisenhower's official post-war assessment stated that the speed, accuracy, and devastating power of American artillery had won the confidence and admiration of the troops it supported and inspired fear and respect in the enemy. Perhaps nowhere was this dominance more dramatically demonstrated than at the Battle of Mortain in August of 1944. By early August, General Patton's Third Army had broken out of the Normandy hedgerows and was racing east across France. Hitler, furious at the collapse of his western defences, personally ordered a massive armoured counterattack aimed at cutting Patton's supply lines and reaching the sea at Avranches. The operation was code-named Lüttich. On August 7th, 4 panzer divisions struck westward through the town of Mortain. The 30th Infantry Division, known as Old Hickory, and commanded by Major General Leland Hobbs, absorbed the full weight of the German armoured assault. The attack came in the pre-dawn darkness, and within hours the situation was desperate. On Hill 314, roughly 700 men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, found themselves completely surrounded and cut off from all ground resupply. German tanks and infantry pressed in from every direction. The men on the hilltop had no armour, limited ammunition, and dwindling medical supplies. What they had were 2 forward observers from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion who held their position near the summit. First Lieutenant Charles Bartz and Second Lieutenant Robert Weiss spent 5 consecutive days calling in concentrated artillery fire on every German column, vehicle, and troop movement visible along the roads below. The gunners of the 230th even stuffed medical supplies into empty shell canisters and fired them up to the trapped men on the hilltop. Of approximately 700 defenders, casualties totaled between 277 and 400 killed, wounded, or missing. The 30th Division suffered roughly 1,800 casualties over the course of the battle, but the German armoured counterattack was shattered. For 5 days, 2 forward observers with radios and binoculars had held at bay armoured forces that outnumbered the hilltop garrison many times over, simply by calling down the full weight of American artillery on every road and field below them. The combination of American artillery and Allied air power broke Operation Lüttich and set the stage for the closing of the Falaise Pocket, where an estimated 50,000 German troops were killed or captured in one of the most catastrophic German defeats of the entire Western Front. At the opposite extreme came the bloodiest and most frustrating American engagement of the European War, the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. Beginning in September of 1944 and grinding on into February of 1945, it remains the longest single battle the United States Army has ever fought. The Hurtgen was a 50-square-mile expanse of dense fir forest, steep ravines, and narrow logging trails, just south of Aachen. The terrain neutralized every American advantage. Tanks could not maneuver between the closely packed trees. Fighter bombers could not identify targets beneath the forest canopy. And the artillery system that had dominated every open engagement turned into a double-edged weapon. German forces had pre-registered their guns on every trail junction, clearing, and crossroads. Every incoming shell that struck a tree detonated above the ground, showering deadly wooden splinters and steel fragments downward onto men who had no overhead cover. Americans and Germans alike suffered terrible casualties from these tree bursts. The American divisions that fought through the Hurtgen suffered at least 33,000 casualties, with some estimates reaching as high as 55,000, when all non-battle losses from frostbite, trench, foot, and pneumonia are included. German losses totaled approximately 28,000. The battle consumed division after division. Units that entered the Hurtgen at full strength emerged as hollow shells within weeks. Major General James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne Division later called the Hurtgen one of the most costly, most unproductive, and most ill-advised battles the American Army had ever fought. The forest stands as the great cautionary tale, proof that when terrain stripped away American advantages in observation, coordination, and open-field firepower, the German army remained capable of devastating resistance. But when the terrain opened again, the American artillery system reasserted its dominance with terrible force. At the Battle of Elsenborn Ridge in December of 1944, the Green 99th Infantry Division, the veteran 2nd Infantry Division under Major General Walter Robertson, and elements of the 1st and 9th Infantry Divisions held the northern shoulder of the Bulge against the full strength of the German 6th SS Panzer Army. The artillery of an entire American corps was massed behind the ridge. On December 22, the divisional artillery supporting the 1st Infantry Division at Dom-Butgenbach fired 10,000 rounds against massed German infantry and armor attacks in a single day. Not a single Panzergrenadier reached the American foxholes. The 12th SS Panzer Division and the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division were broken on Elsenborn Ridge. On December 19, the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division alone lost 15 tanks to American artillery. The German main axis of advance in the northern sector was permanently sealed. Colonel Oskar Axelson, commanding the 406th Field Artillery Group, had authorized the immediate field use of the secret proximity fuze on his own authority on December 16, the first day of the offensive. Eisenhower formally requested clearance to use the fuze against ground targets on December 19, and all restrictions were lifted within days. But by then, Axelson's gunners had already proven what the airburst shells could do. Elsenborn Ridge was the engagement where every element of American artillery superiority converged at once, and it stopped the most powerful German offensive of the war's final year cold in its tracks. But artillery was only half of the reason German troops kept hearing sounds they could not explain. The other half was a unit unlike anything the United States Army had ever created. On January 20, 1944, at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the United States Army activated one of the most unusual military formations in history. Officially designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, Colonel Harry Reeder commanded the unit from activation through the end of the war in Europe, and it consisted of approximately 1,100 men organized into 4 specialized companies. The concept was developed by Major Ralph Ingersoll, a prominent New York journalist and publisher before the war, and Colonel Billy Harris of the Special Plans Branch in London. The 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion Special, 379 men, handled visual deception. They inflated rubber tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, and even aircraft, all painted with accurate unit markings and positioned to deceive both aerial reconnaissance and distant ground observers. An inflatable Sherman tank weighed only about 93 pounds and could be lifted into position by 4 men, yet from several hundred yards away it was virtually indistinguishable from the genuine 33-ton vehicle. The Signal Company Special, 296 men, conducted radio deception. These operators studied and then imitated the call signs, message formats, and even the individual keying rhythms of real unit radio operators. The phantom traffic they generated was so convincing that German signals intelligence repeatedly accepted entire fictional divisions as genuine combat formations. The 406th Engineer Combat Company, 168 men under Captain George Rebb, provided perimeter security, and used bulldozers to press convincing tank tracks into muddy roads leading to the dummy positions. And then there was the Ghost Army's most haunting capability. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company Special numbered just 145 men. Their weapon was sound. Working with engineers from Bell Telephone Laboratories, this small unit had recorded the sounds of war at Fort Knox, Kentucky, using state-of-the-art wire recorders. They captured the rumble of tank engines idling and revving, the metallic clank of treads on paved roads, the rhythmic hammering of bridge construction, the grinding of heavy trucks in low gear, and the shouts of sergeants directing traffic in staging areas. Each operation required the sound technicians to mix these individual recordings into a single, convincing audio program, a sonic portrait of whatever phantom force they needed to project that night. The final programs were played through enormous amplifiers, powering speakers that weighed 500 pounds each, mounted on half-tracks that could creep into position under cover of darkness. Under favorable weather and terrain conditions, the broadcast sounds were audible up to 15 miles away. The equipment was considered so sensitive that every sonic half-track was rigged with explosive charges. If the unit faced capture, a 15-second self-destruct lever would obliterate every wire recorder, amplifier, and speaker before they could fall into enemy hands. The Ghost Army conducted over 20 deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany between June of 1944 and March of 1945. Their first major combined effort came at the Siege of Brest in August of 1944, where all four deception methods, visual, sonic, radio, and physical, were employed together in support of the 8th Corps for the first time. The experience at Brest taught the unit hard lessons about the dangers of coordinating deception with real combat operations in close proximity, and those lessons shaped every operation that followed. But it was Operation Bettemberg in September of 1944 that became the unit's longest and most harrowing deception of the war. When Patton's Third Army pushed toward Metz, a dangerous gap of 25 to 70 miles opened in the Allied line, defended by nothing more than a single cavalry squadron of the 3rd Cavalry Group under Colonel James Polk, a force far too thin to hold against any serious German probe. The Ghost Army moved into the gap and used roughly 400 to 500 men to simulate the presence of the entire 6th Armoured Division, a force of roughly 8,000 troops with tanks, artillery, and transport vehicles. Sonic trucks ran on 4 consecutive moonless nights, broadcasting the sounds of armoured columns, rolling through the darkness toward assembly areas that existed only on the deception plan. Sergeant Dick Syracuse, one of the sonic operators, later recalled that in those black moonless nights the roaring columns were extremely realistic, and that after a while his eyes began telling him what his ears were hearing, until he started to see tanks that were not there. Patton himself, in a letter to his wife, acknowledged that there was one rather bad spot in his line but expressed confidence that the enemy did not know about it. The deception held for 8 nerve-wracking days until the 83rd Infantry Division arrived to fill the gap. The official history of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops credits this single operation with giving rise to the German nickname for the real 6th Armoured Division, the Phantom Division. In December of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge itself, the Ghost Army carried out Operation Kodak, a radio-only deception designed to draw German attention away from General Patton's drive to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne. Without inflatable tanks or sonic trucks, relying solely on the skill of their radio operators to simulate an entire division's communications traffic, the unit created a phantom force that German signals intelligence tracked and reported as genuine. The Ghost Army's largest and most consequential operation was Operation Viersen in March of 1945, coordinated by Lieutenant Colonel Merrick Truly with the 9th Army Staff in preparation for the Rhine crossing. The 23rd simulated 2 entire infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th, a phantom force of approximately 40,000 men, in the 13th Corps Zone, 10 miles south of the actual crossing point, selected for the 16th Corps. More than 600 dummy vehicles were inflated and arranged in realistic motor pools. Fake radio nets broadcast authentic traffic patterns for an army preparing to assault a river. Allied reconnaissance aircraft photographed the dummy positions to create the appearance of genuine operational planning. Sonic trucks broadcast the sounds of pontoon bridge construction through the night, while flash canisters on the ground simulated the muzzle blasts of artillery batteries. The Germans took the bait completely. They shelled the inflatable equipment for days, expending precious ammunition on rubber and canvas. German intelligence reported American units converging on the dummy site, and German formations redeployed to oppose a river assault that was never going to come. When the Ninth Army, under Lieutenant General William Simpson, launched its actual Rhine crossing on March 24, 1945, it encountered disorganized and under-strength resistance and suffered only approximately 30 casualties in the assault wave. Simpson issued a formal letter of commendation to the 23rd. Historians and the Ghost Army Legacy Project estimate that over the course of the war, the unit's deceptions may have saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. The innovations of American artillerymen and Ghost Army operators did not emerge from nowhere. They belonged to a long tradition of using sound and hidden force to shape the outcome of battles before opposing soldiers ever met face to face. During the First World War, the British physicist Sir William Lawrence Bragg, who had already won the Nobel Prize in Physics, led a team that developed the science of artillery sound ranging on the Western Front. Working under Canadian Colonel Andrew McNaughton, they placed arrays of microphones behind Allied lines and timed the arrival of muzzle blasts from German guns, triangulating enemy battery positions to within 10 to 25 meters. By the Battle of Arras in April of 1917, this technology had fundamentally altered the counter-battery duel. By the end of the Second World War, the American Army maintained 25 field artillery observation battalions with 13,000 men dedicated solely to sound and flash ranging. The Ghost Army's intellectual origins traced directly to British deception in North Africa, particularly Operation Bertram before the Battle of El Alamein in October of 1942, where the British disguised real tanks as supply trucks and constructed elaborate dummy pipelines and water storage points to draw Rommel's reserves to the wrong sector of the front. The legacy of these wartime innovations reshaped military doctrine for generations that followed. The Fire Direction Center became the universal standard for Western artillery coordination and the backbone of NATO interoperability across dozens of allied nations. Time on target remained standard firing doctrine through the Korean War and the Vietnam War, where massed American artillery broke Chinese and North Vietnamese human wave attacks on isolated firebases with the same devastating simultaneity that had shattered German formations at Elsenborn Ridge 2 decades earlier. The technological lineage runs in an unbroken line from the plotting boards and field telephones of Fort Sill in the 1930s to the field artillery digital automated computer introduced in the 1960s to the computerized fire control systems used by modern armies today. The United States Army Field Artillery School continues to operate at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which has been called the home of field artillery since 1911. The principles that Brewer, Ward, and their colleagues worked out on dusty Oklahoma training grounds, in peacetime, remain the foundation of every artillery fire mission conducted by American forces and their allies around the world. What began as a classroom exercise at Fort Sill became the deadliest innovation of the ground war in Europe. The Ghost Army's influence followed a different and quieter path. Because the unit's operations remained classified until 1996, its tactical innovations could not be openly studied or incorporated into military doctrine for more than half a century. But when the files were finally declassified, military analysts recognized that the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had pioneered concepts that are now central to modern information warfare. The idea of using coordinated visual, sonic, radio, and physical deception to project a false picture of military strength across an entire sector of a front anticipated what contemporary defense planners now call multi-domain deception. The Ghost Army's methods are explicitly referenced in American discussions of operations against technologically sophisticated adversaries. The challenge of fooling not just ground observers but also signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and civilian informants simultaneously is, if anything, more relevant in the age of satellite surveillance and electronic warfare than it was in 1944. For more than half a century, the unit's veterans lived with a secret they could not share with their families, their friends, or the American public. In February of 2022, President Joseph Biden signed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act into law. The medal was formally presented at the United States Capitol on March 21, 2024, to 3 surviving members of the unit: Bernard Bluestein, Seymour Nussenbaum, and John Chrisman, all approaching or past 100 years of age, finally received public recognition for what they had accomplished 8 decades earlier. Today, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans curates a traveling exhibit dedicated to the Ghost Army. The Ghost Army Legacy Project in Chicago, founded by documentary filmmaker Rick Beyer, preserves veterans' oral histories, wartime sketches, and personal artifacts. Major Carpenter's Grasshopper, named Rosie the Rocketer, with its bazooka tubes still attached to the wing struts, is maintained in flying condition at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts. And at the United States Army Field Artillery Museum at Fort Sill, visitors can stand beside a Black Dragon howitzer, a Long Tom, and an M2A1, and examine the original Fire Direction Center plotting equipment that changed the way wars are fought across the world. The museum holds over 70 artillery pieces spanning more than 2 centuries of American military history, but it is the modest plotting boards and field telephones of the Second World War era that tell the most consequential story. Remarkably, the Republic of China still maintains operational 240mm M1 howitzers in hardened bunkers on Kinmen and Matsu Islands, off the coast of mainland China, the only place in the world where the Black Dragon remains in active military service more than 80 years after it first fired at Anzio. Between 1944 and 1945, German soldiers on the Western Front confronted a kind of warfare that no previous army had ever faced. They heard shells arrive from beyond the horizon without a single ranging shot to betray the gunners' intentions. They endured the synchronized detonation of time-on-target barrages that turned open ground into killing fields in a single heartbeat. They felt the crack of proximity fuses detonating above their heads, reaching down into positions that should have been safe from anything but a direct hit. They heard the patient drone of unarmed grasshoppers circling overhead, marking them for destruction they could not escape. And on dark nights along quiet sectors of the front, they heard the unmistakable sounds of armored columns assembling beyond the next ridge. Sounds so convincing that German generals redeployed entire formations to meet attacks that existed only on thin wire, threaded through playback machines bolted to the beds of half-tracks. The forward observers who crawled within sight of enemy lines to call in fire knew the risks of their work with absolute clarity. The L-Bird pilots who flew unarmed over hostile territory at 1,500 feet accepted that a single rifle round through their fabric fuselage could end everything. The artillerymen who computed firing solutions through freezing Ardennes nights and sweltering Normandy summers understood that their contributions would never make front-page headlines. And the Ghost Army's sonic operators, camouflage artists, and radio impersonators carried out their missions, knowing that if their positions were overrun, the self-destruct charges on their half-tracks would be the last sound they would ever hear. These men waged a war defined not by the clash of bayonets or the charge of tanks, but by the mastery of distance, mathematics, deception, and the invisible physics of sound crossing a battlefield. They reached across miles of countryside with radio waves, wire recordings, and high explosive, and they broke the combat power of the German army before a single American rifleman ever had to rise from his foxhole and cross the open ground. By the time German defenders finally saw American soldiers advancing toward their positions, the outcome had almost always already been decided by what they had been hearing for hours, days, and sometimes weeks beforehand. Sound came first. Victory followed.